Hey guys! Tonight we slip barefoot across cold marble floors, past doors that were never meant to be opened, into a palace that looks perfectly calm while hiding centuries of very deliberate forgetting. You can almost smell the wax from guttering candles, hear fabric sigh as someone vanishes down a corridor, feel that uneasy sense that the walls themselves are listening. This is the kind of place where silence is curated, where history has been tidied up with the same care as a state banquet. And, fair warning, you probably won't survive this story with your childhood view of royalty intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always strange and wonderful to know where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move slowly because that's how you're supposed to move in a palace like this. Quiet, careful, as if noise itself could be treason. During the day, these halls are all ceremony, footmen standing like furniture, courtiers smiling with their mouths and not their eyes, portraits that insist everything was orderly and dignified. But at night, when the court sleeps and the guards grow bored, the palace exhales. That's when the secrets start whispering. One mainstream historical fact you can anchor yourself to right away is this. Royal courts were information machines. From Versailles to the Forbidden City, monarchies relied on layers of servants, clerks, ladies-in-waiting, and guards to function. And where there are that many people, there are rumours, lots of them. In fact, historians know that European courts in the early modern period were so saturated with gossip that ambassadors often based foreign policy decisions on what servants whispered near staircases. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's how intelligence worked before wiretaps. You're standing near a service corridor now, the kind visitors never see. It's narrow, practical, a little damp. This is where the real history slipped through. Servants were officially invisible, but they saw everything. Who cried behind locked doors, who received letters at odd hours, who didn't come back from an evening walk. There's a quirky tidbit historians love to mention. At Versailles, servants were paid bonuses for reporting irregular behaviour, which turned the palace into something like an 18th century group chat, with everyone lurking and no one trustworthy. And yet, for all that watching, so much still vanished. Letters burned, pages torn out, names scratched away from records. You can almost hear it, the faint rasp of parchment being destroyed while someone mutters about the good of the crown. Historians still argue whether this culture of erasure was centrally planned or simply an instinctive reflex of power protecting itself. Was there a mastermind? Or did everyone just know what needed to disappear? You walk past a grand gallery, moonlight slicing across polished floors. The portraits stare down with serene confidence, but look closer. You're good at that now. You notice gaps, literal ones, spaces where a painting should be, frames that were reused, a background figure painted over. One well-documented fact is that disgraced royals were often removed from visual history. In Tudor England, for example, images of Anne Boleyn were systematically destroyed after her execution. That wasn't symbolic, it was practical. If people couldn't see her, maybe they'd forget she ever stood where she stood. Of course, forgetting never quite works, does it? You pause near a window. Outside, gardens stretch into darkness, hedges trimmed into obedience. During the day, they're charming. At night, they feel like accomplices. This is where whispers travelled fastest, between servants' quarters, through laundry rooms, down back staircases. There's a fringe tidbit that always makes historians raise an eyebrow. Some courts believed certain corridors amplified sound in specific ways, and servants learned exactly where to stand to overhear private conversations. Acoustic espionage, centuries before microphones. Whether that's fully true or just a delicious rumor is debated, but the fact remains, privacy in palaces was mostly an illusion. And that illusion mattered, because what the public saw was stability. What you're seeing now is fragility. Power here depends on everyone agreeing not to notice certain things. A missing prince, a queen who stops appearing at events, a sudden illness announced with suspicious efficiency. Remember this feeling, because you'll come back to it again and again. The sense that history didn't just happen, it was managed. You drift toward a staircase broad and ceremonial. Kings descended these stairs in full regalia. Queens paused halfway for dramatic effect. But at night, it's just stone and shadow. You imagine the feet that have climbed these steps in a hurry, hearts pounding, messengers carrying bad news, servants summoned after midnight. There's a well-known historical fact that royal households often ran on nocturnal schedules. Important decisions were made late, precisely because fewer people were awake to witness them. This is where a light joke slips in, because otherwise it all gets a bit heavy. If you think your workplace has toxic after-hours meetings, at least your boss probably isn't deciding who gets erased from the family tree at 2 a.m. Progress, right? You stop near a closed door. Officially, it leads to storage. Unofficially, who knows? Palaces were full of such rooms, archives within archives. One mainstream fact scholars agree on is that royal archives were curated long before modern historians arrived. Documents weren't just stored, they were selected. What survived did so because someone allowed it, and what didn't survive often disappeared for very good reasons. There's a fringe story about a cache of letters found hidden behind a false wall in a European palace during renovations in the 19th century. Letters detailing an affair between a royal and a courtier that could have destabilized alliances. Some claim they were quietly returned to the family and destroyed again. Others think the story itself is a later invention, a way to dramatize how much we assume is missing. Historians still argue whether such discoveries were rare accidents or the tip of a very carefully buried iceberg. As you move on, you start to realize something unsettling. The palace isn't just a place where secrets happened. It's a machine designed to absorb them. Thick walls, long corridors, rigid hierarchies. Everything about it slows information down, distorts it, reshapes it. By the time a rumor reaches the outside world, it's been softened, polished, or weaponized. And you walking here now feel that tension between what was lived and what was recorded. This is the core of palace secrets, not scandal for its own sake, but the gap between experience and memory, between the night and the official morning announcement. You pass a small chapel, candles burned low, confessionals stand like patient mouths. Religion was woven deeply into royal life, and confession was supposed to cleanse the soul. But it also created witnesses. Priests heard things no one else did. We'll come back to them later, but for now, note this. Even sacred spaces weren't safe from politics. Silence could be holy, or it could be enforced. Another light joke, because your brain needs oxygen. Imagine trying to whisper a forbidden secret while wearing 10 layers of brocade and a wig that weighs more than your self-esteem. Glamorous? Yes. Comfortable? Absolutely not. You reach the end of the corridor. There's nowhere else to go without turning back. And that feels right. Section 1 is about orientation, learning how to move, how to listen. You don't know the full stories yet, but you can feel them pressing in. The palace has taught you its first lesson. What you don't see is often more important than what you do. As you turn, remember this atmosphere. Remember the servants' whispers, the missing portraits, the doors that pretend to lead nowhere, because everything that follows, every inconvenient heir, every silenced woman, every accidental death grows out of this space, this carefully controlled quiet. And as you step away, the palace doesn't protest. It never does, it just waits. You keep walking because once the palace has let you in on its first secret, it doesn't really give you the option to leave. The corridors subtly change here. The ceilings lower just enough to make you feel watched, and the portraits thin out, as if even painted faces were discouraged from lingering too long. This is where the story of the king who wasn't meant to rule begins, not with a coronation, but with a quiet decision made long before anyone outside these walls knew a choice had been taken away. You feel it before you understand it. A sense of someone missing, not dead, not disgraced, just absent. Palaces are very good at that kind of absence. They don't announce it, they normalize it. One day a name appears in ledgers, seating charts, baptismal records. The next, it doesn't. And if you weren't paying attention, you'd assume it was never there to begin with. Here's a mainstream historical fact that anchors this unease. Royal succession was rarely as clean as official genealogies suggest. Across Europe and Asia, dynasties routinely adjusted inheritance lines to suit political convenience. Younger sons were sidelined, older brothers quietly discredited, cousins elevated with suspicious speed. The idea that the crown always passed to the rightful heir is one of history's most carefully maintained fairy tales. You stop near a window overlooking an inner courtyard. It's small, almost apologetic, the kind of space meant for pacing rather than parades. You imagine a boy here once, well-dressed, well-educated, and increasingly aware that something about his future was shifting. He wasn't told outright. That would have been messy. Instead, the signs accumulated, tutors dismissed, invitations delayed, responsibilities redistributed. Power doesn't always slam doors. Sometimes it just stops opening them. There's a quirky tidbit historians love because it feels so human. In several royal households, sidelined heirs were given elaborate but meaningless titles, honorifics that sounded impressive but carried no authority. It was the dynastic equivalent of being promoted to special advisor and quietly removed from every meeting that mattered. You keep the clothes, the allowance, the illusion, you lose the future. As you move deeper into this wing of the palace, the air feels heavier. This is where contingency lived. Monarchies planned obsessively for succession because uncertainty was dangerous. A disputed heir could mean civil war. So when someone didn't fit the plan, too sickly, too stubborn, too inconvenient, the solution was often erasure by redirection. Sent to the church, sent abroad, married off strategically, or in some cases, simply rewritten. Historians still argue whether these decisions were driven more by fear or by calculation. Was the sidelining of an heir an emotional reaction to perceived weakness or a cold assessment of political risk? The records rarely tell you because the records were written by the people who benefited from the outcome. You pause beside a desk, its surface polished smooth by generations of anxious hands. You imagine the documents that once lay here, draft proclamations, sealed letters, genealogies with marginal notes. A known historical fact is that official family trees were often revised after the fact, dates adjusted, birth orders clarified in suspiciously convenient ways. Sometimes a line would simply stop. There's a fringe story that circulates among palace historians about a prince whose name was removed from baptismal records and replaced with a blank space, the ink scraped away so thoroughly that the parchment thinned. Whether that exact case is real or symbolic hardly matters. The practice of physical alteration absolutely was. Ink knives were as much tools of power as swords. You imagine the moment when the decision became irreversible. Maybe it happened in a council chamber with murmured agreement and careful phrasing. Or maybe it happened alone, a ruler staring at a list of children and realizing one of them threatened the stability of everything built so far. There's no drama in that kind of choice. That's what makes it terrifying. Another light joke slips in because your brain needs relief. If only family group chats had existed back then. Nothing like, "You have been removed from the line of succession," delivered with a polite thumbs-up emoji. You move again, past rooms that feel less ceremonial, more domestic. This is where the sidelined heir would have lived out the rest of his relevance, still royal, still watched, but no longer dangerous. One mainstream fact is that many such figures were kept close precisely to control them. Exile was risky. Proximity allowed surveillance. The palace preferred problems it could see. You notice how the walls here seem thicker. Sound doesn't travel as easily. That's deliberate. Privacy, when granted, was strategic. Silence could be containment. And yet, even contained lives leaked into rumor. Servants noticed who stopped receiving visitors, who wasn't mentioned in prayers, who never quite aged in official portraits because the portraits stopped being commissioned. There's a strange fringe detail from one court where a displaced heir was required to attend official ceremonies but never allowed to stand beneath the canopy reserved for royalty. Always a step to the side, always visible, but never central. It's the kind of cruelty that only protocol can deliver. Technically respectful, emotionally devastating. Historians still argue whether such treatment was meant to humiliate or to pacify. Was it punishment, or was it a way of keeping peace by reminding everyone that the threat had already been neutralized? You linger near a doorway and imagine overhearing fragments of conversation. It's for the good of the realm. He understands, surely. Better this than chaos. These phrases repeat throughout history because they work. They turn personal loss into abstract necessity. They make cruelty feel administrative. A well-established historical example echoes in your mind. Ivan VI of Russia, crowned as an infant and then imprisoned for most of his life after a coup removed him. He wasn't executed immediately. That would have been scandalous. Instead, he was hidden, guarded, erased from public consciousness. When he finally died, it was almost an administrative footnote. This is what happens when an heir becomes an inconvenience rather than a person. You feel a chill that has nothing to do with temperature. The palace doesn't mourn these figures, it absorbs them. Their existence becomes a cautionary tale whispered to future heirs. Fit the role, or the role will find someone else. Another gentle joke, because even bleak histories deserve a breath. Suddenly family pressure at holiday dinners doesn't feel quite as intense, does it? As you step away from this wing, you understand something crucial. The king who wasn't meant to rule isn't always the one who lost. Sometimes it's the one who won, shaped by the knowledge that someone else was erased to make room for him. That awareness breeds paranoia, insecurity, and an obsession with control. You'll see that pattern again. The palace teaches its future rulers early. Power is conditional. Love is optional. Memory is negotiable. You glance back once more. The courtyard remains empty. The windows give nothing away. Official history will tell you the succession was smooth, inevitable, divinely sanctioned. What it won't tell you is about the life bent quietly out of shape so that inevitability could exist. And as you move on, the palace adjusts around you, seamless as ever, ready to pretend this story never happened. You don't leave the palace wing so much as drift into the next one, because that's how these stories work. No clean breaks, just subtle shifts in lighting and expectation. The air smells faintly of starch and perfume here, a careful blend meant to signal refinement rather than authority. This is the domain of queens, consorts, and women who were taught very early that power was something you exercised sideways. You notice it immediately. The rooms are brighter, softer, upholstered, within an inch of their lives. Nothing sharp, nothing overt. And yet this is one of the most dangerous parts of the palace. History tends to present queens as decorative, emotional, or tragically passive, but that version exists because it was useful. The real story lives in glances, seating arrangements, and what wasn't said at the right moment. Here's a mainstream historical fact to ground you. In many monarchies, queens and royal women wielded significant political influence without holding formal authority. They controlled access to the ruler, shaped court culture, managed patronage networks, and often acted as informal diplomats. Catherine de' Medici, for instance, never ruled outright as queen regnant, yet she steered French politics for decades through marriage alliances, regencies, and carefully staged appearances. You move past a salon where chairs are arranged in conversational clusters. This wasn't accidental. Furniture placement was political. Who sat near whom, who stood, who entered last, these were signals everyone at court understood. A queen didn't need to issue orders if she could simply decide who got invited to tea. Exclusion was a weapon, and it rarely left bruises. There's a quirky tidbit historians love because it sounds so harmless: embroidery. Royal women were encouraged to sew, ostensibly as a pastime. In reality, embroidery circles were information hubs. While hands worked on silk, ears stayed alert. Gossip flowed freely in these spaces, precisely because men underestimated them. Some surviving textiles even contain subtle symbols and initials that scholars believe referenced alliances or private loyalties. Craft as coded communication, history's quiet flex. You stop near a mirror, tall and flattering, positioned to catch light at the perfect angle. Queens were always on display, but they were also always watching. You imagine one standing here, practicing a smile that revealed nothing. She had learned early that emotion was a liability unless deployed strategically. A well-timed tear could sway a council. A serene expression could end a rumor. This was emotional labor on a geopolitical scale. Historians still argue whether queens consciously developed these tactics or simply adapted out of necessity. Was this quiet influence a form of empowerment or a survival mechanism within a system that denied them open authority? The answer, unhelpfully, appears to be both. You walk past a bedchamber, intimate and heavily guarded. This space mattered far beyond romance. The Queen's body was political territory. Fertility was scrutinized. Timing was discussed in whispers. One well-established fact is that royal pregnancies were public events, with witnesses present at births to prevent substitution. Privacy was sacrificed in the name of legitimacy, which is a sentence that sums up royal womanhood rather efficiently. A fringe tidbit, both strange and unsettling. In some courts, queens were subjected to folk remedies meant to increase fertility, herbal concoctions, talismans, even practices borrowed from local superstition. One infamous example involved crocodile dung as a supposed contraceptive or fertility aid, depending on the era and location. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? Yes, history really did that, more than once. You imagine how a queen navigated this constant scrutiny, publicly adored, privately isolated, every friendship evaluated for threat, every word potentially reported. And yet within these constraints, many women carved out real power. They arranged marriages, they funded artists and clerics who shaped public opinion. They whispered suggestions at precisely the right moment. You paused near a writing desk. Letters were everything. One mainstream historical fact is that queens maintained vast correspondence networks. Some letters were loving, others were ruthlessly strategic. Ink could do what decrees could not. And because letters were private, they offered plausible deniability. If discovered, intentions could be reframed. Oh, I didn't mean it that way. A timeless classic. Historians still argue whether certain queens were the true architects of policy or merely influential advisors. The difficulty lies in evidence. Many letters were destroyed, edited, or selectively preserved. What survives often does so because it was safe to survive. The most dangerous correspondence tended to vanish. You sit with that for a moment. How many decisions attributed to kings were nudged into being by women who never signed their names? How many wars, alliances, and purges trace back to a conversation held in a room like this, with soft cushions and polite laughter? Another light joke drifts in because the weight is building. This is basically the original soft power, except instead of think tanks and press releases, you had embroidery hoops and impeccable posture. You notice something else now, the loneliness. Queens were often foreigners, married off to cement alliances. They arrived young, speaking the wrong language, surrounded by people paid to watch them. One well-known historical fact is that many royal marriages were deeply unhappy, but emotional dissatisfaction was considered irrelevant. Producing heirs mattered, personal fulfillment did not. There's a fringe account of a queen who kept a secret notebook written in a private cipher. Only she and her sister understood. The notebook vanished after her death. Whether it was ever real or merely rumoured, it captures something true. The need for a private self in a world that consumed you publicly. You move toward the doorway, feeling the quiet pressure of all those unspoken calculations. These women weren't powerless, they were constrained. And within those constraints they learned to rule from the shadows, sometimes gently, sometimes brutally. Historians still argue whether history has underestimated or deliberately diminished their roles. The answer depends on who wrote the history and why. What's clear is this. The palace could not function without them, even as it denied them overt credit. As you leave this wing, the softness fades. The air grows cooler, more formal. You carry with you the understanding that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers, smiles, and waits. And the palace, as always, lets you pass because you're starting to see it the way it sees itself. You don't notice the temperature drop at first. It's subtle, like the palace easing you into something unpleasant out of politeness. The corridors narrow again, the light thins, and the air carries that faint medicinal smell that clings to places where people waited for news they already suspected. This is where deaths happened quickly, too quickly, and where explanations arrived faster than grief ever could. You slow your steps without meaning to. Everyone does here. These are the rooms where a life could end between dinner and dawn, and by breakfast it would already be called an accident. Here's a mainstream historical fact that frames everything you're about to feel. Sudden death was common in pre-modern courts, but not always for natural reasons. Poisoning, arsenic, mercury, belladonna, was well known and notoriously difficult to detect with contemporary medicine. Official causes like fever, apoplexy, or weak constitution covered a multitude of sins. If the court physicians agreed, the record was sealed, and they usually agreed. You pause near a doorway where the paint has been touched up too often. This room has been refreshed repeatedly, as if freshness could overwrite memory. You imagine the scene, a noble collapsing mid-conversation, a servant screaming, someone already calculating what this means for the succession. Panic on the surface, efficiency underneath. There's a quirky but unsettling tidbit historians often mention. Royal tasters existed not just to protect monarchs, but to create plausible deniability. If the taster lived, the food was safe. If the monarch died anyway, well, clearly it wasn't the meal. This logic wasn't comforting, it was convenient. You walk past a bedchamber, curtains drawn even now in your imagination. Deaths here were private but never intimate. Bodies became political objects immediately. Who saw them? Who prepared them? How quickly burial occurred? One well-established fact is that rapid burials were sometimes justified on religious grounds, but they also conveniently limited examination. The The faster the body disappeared, the fewer questions could be asked. Historians still argue whether many of these deaths were murders or simply the result of harsh living conditions and poor medicine. And they're right to argue. History is messy, but the pattern is hard to ignore. When someone inconvenient died, the explanation was always ready, almost rehearsed. You think of the phrases "it had taken suddenly," "God's will," "a brief illness." They appear again and again in court records, smoothing over shock like a well-worn blanket. One mainstream example echoes loudly. King Charles VIII of France, who died after striking his head on a door lintel. Accident? Possibly. Convenient, uncomfortably so. His death reshaped European politics overnight. You step closer to the window, needing air. Outside, the world continues. Inside, memory stalls. There's a fringe theory that some palaces kept unofficial death logs, private notes, maintained by senior servants, tracking who died, when, and under what suspicious circumstances. No such log has ever been conclusively found, but the rumour persists because it feels necessary. As if someone, somewhere, had to be keeping score. Another light joke floats in because otherwise this gets unbearable. Imagine HR labelling all this as unexpected departures due to environmental factors. Same energy. You turn down another corridor and the smell changes again, incense this time. Chapels often sat close to sick rooms. Prayer moved in quickly after medicine failed. One known historical fact is that last rites were sometimes administered astonishingly fast, occasionally before family members arrived. Once a soul was officially commended to God, debate tended to end. You imagine the moment when suspicion flickered. A servant notices a cup not usually used. A physician hesitates before signing a report. A widow asks one question too many and is gently escorted away. This is how doubt dies, not with answers, but with exhaustion. Historians still argue whether courts normalize these deaths to protect stability or to protect perpetrators. Again, the answer is probably both. Stability required silence. Silence protected power. You pass a small antechamber where chairs line the walls. This was where people waited for news, for permission to grieve, for instruction on how to react. Emotional responses were regulated here. Cry too loudly, and you risk implying suspicion. Stay too calm, and you risk implying guilt. Mourning itself was political choreography. There's a fringe anecdote about a queen who insisted on keeping her husband's body unburied for days, refusing official explanations. Some see it as love. Others see it as protest. The records politely frame it as overwhelming grief. Historians still argue whether that grief was personal or pointed. You feel the weight of all those unasked questions pressing in. The palace thrives on plausible endings. It doesn't need you to believe the story, only to repeat it. Another gentle joke, because you're allowed one, suddenly your family's insistence on detailed autopsy reports starts to feel downright progressive. As you move on, you realize something unsettling. Even when deaths were natural, the systems surrounding them trained everyone to accept ambiguity, to move on quickly, to prioritize continuity over clarity. That habit made actual crimes easier to hide. When everything is already quiet, silence doesn't stand out. You glance back at the closed doors, the polished floors, the immaculate records. Official history will list dates and causes, tidy and authoritative. What it won't record is the hesitation in the room, the glance exchanged between servants, the way someone stopped trusting the air they breathed. The palace doesn't haunt itself with ghosts. It haunts itself with unanswered questions. And as you leave this wing behind, you carry the understanding that some deaths weren't meant to be mourned, only managed. You don't need a map to know when you've entered the territory of forbidden love. The palace gives it away with its contradictions. Rooms meant for privacy sit uncomfortably close to corridors meant for surveillance. Windows are positioned beautifully, but never without a line of sight from somewhere else. This is where affection learned to whisper, because speaking plainly could undo empires. You feel it immediately, that soft, dangerous tension that comes when something deeply human collides with something ruthlessly political. Love in a palace was never just love, it was a liability. Here's a mainstream historical fact to steady yourself. Royal marriages were primarily diplomatic tools. Across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, unions were arranged to secure alliances, end wars, and produce heirs. Personal desire ranked somewhere below livestock inventories. Falling in love with the wrong person wasn't romantic rebellion, it was a threat to national stability. You move past a series of small sitting rooms, each more discreet than the last. These were the spaces where glances lingered a second too long, where letters were passed under the pretense of errands, where footsteps paused in doorways after curfew. The palace didn't forbid love outright, it regulated it. Approved affection was celebrated publicly. Unapproved affection was erased privately. There's a quirky tidbit historians quietly adore. Secret doors. Many palaces contained hidden passages designed for servants, but they were also repurposed for discreet movement between rooms. Some were added long after construction, suggesting a need that architects never acknowledged on paper. Romance, it seems, inspired renovations. You imagine the risk calculus involved. Every meeting carried consequences. Discovery could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse, not just for the lovers, but for their families. This is why forbidden love so often ended in silence rather than scandal. A vanished courtier, a sudden reassignment, a portrait quietly removed from a wall. The palace excelled at subtraction. Historians still argue whether these relationships were more common than records suggest, or simply more successfully hidden. Given how much effort went into suppressing them, the latter seems optimistic at best. You pause near a writing desk again. These keep appearing, don't they? Letters were the lifeline of forbidden affection. Written carefully, coded subtly, destroyed promptly. One well-known historical fact is that royal correspondents often used agreed-upon phrases to signal intimacy without stating it outright. Your health remains my greatest concern could mean far more than it appeared to. Language bent itself around danger. A fringe detail, deliciously specific. Some lovers used shared prayer books to exchange notes, slipping messages between pages that could plausibly be explained away as bookmarks. Sacred objects made excellent camouflage. Who would dare inspect them too closely? You imagine the moment of discovery. It rarely happened with drama. More often, it arrived as a quiet knock, a summons, a look that said someone had noticed. And then came the choice, not between love and duty, but between love and survival. You walk past a long gallery, its floor echoing softly underfoot. This is where exiles began, not the dramatic kind announced to crowds, but the polite ones. A position abroad, an extended visit, a necessary retreat for health. One mainstream historical fact is that exile was a preferred solution because it removed the problem without creating a martyr. Distance dulled memory. Absence rewrote narratives. Historians still argue whether exile was meant as mercy or punishment. Again, it functioned as both. Lovers were separated, threats neutralized. The court returned to order. You think of famous examples, Edward VIII abdicating for Wallis Simpson, or earlier princes and princesses forced to choose between crown and companionship. Those are the cases history remembers because they exploded publicly. What you're walking through now are the hundreds of cases that didn't, the quiet ones, the successful suppressions. Another light joke floats in because the mood needs oxygen. Suddenly we're taking a break sounds a lot less dramatic than you are being relocated to another country so the monarchy doesn't collapse. You pass a window overlooking a distant road. This is where carriages departed at odd hours, where farewells were brief, carefully unobserved. There's a fringe account of a lady-in-waiting who vanished overnight after rumours of an affair with a royal heir. Officially, she returned to her family. No record of her marriage or death exists afterward. Whether she lived quietly or met a darker end is unknown. Historians still argue whether such disappearances indicate brutality or bureaucratic efficiency. You feel the ache of that uncertainty. Forbidden love didn't always end in tragedy, but it almost always ended in loss. Even when lovers survived, they rarely emerged unchanged. Trust eroded, joy dulled, fear became a permanent companion. One mainstream historical fact underscores this. Courts often enforced strict separation between men and women at night precisely to limit opportunity. Curfews were real. Chaperones relentless. The palace understood temptation well enough to design architecture against it. You stop in a narrow passage where sound carries too clearly. You imagine whispers bouncing off stone, magnified unintentionally. This is where rumours were born. Half-heard phrases, misinterpreted gestures. Sometimes the palace acted not on truth, but on the threat of perception. Even innocent affection could be punished if it looked dangerous enough. Historians still argue whether the palace feared love itself or the loss of control love represented. Love introduces unpredictability. Unpredictability terrifies systems built on lineage and order. You think of the people erased not because they acted, but because they might. Potential was enough. Suspicion sufficient. The palace didn't wait for proof when the stakes were high. Another gentle joke slips in because even this deserves a breath. Suddenly your workplace's no dating policy feels ambitious, but at least no one's getting exiled. As you move on, you realize something quietly devastating. Forbidden love didn't just punish individuals, it trained everyone else. It taught courtiers to police themselves, to suppress attachment, to perform loyalty even in private. Over time, that self-censorship became culture. You glance back one last time. The rooms look innocent, comfortable, romantic even. Official history might frame these spaces as places of leisure, conversation, elegance. What it won't tell you is how many hearts learned to beat more softly here, just in case someone was listening. And as you leave, the palace resumes its calm, satisfied that affection, like everything else, has been properly managed. You feel it before you see it, the sense of something unfinished, of footsteps that never quite came back. This wing of the palace smells faintly of chalk dust and old paper, the kind of place meant to suggest learning and improvement. Education, they called it. A harmless word, a comforting one. But here it carries an echo, because this is where children were sent away, not expelled, not punished, removed. You walk slowly because this story doesn't like to be rushed. The rooms are smaller here, more practical, less ceremonial, desks instead of thrones, shelves instead of portraits. The palace wanted this part to feel ordinary, almost benevolent. After all, what could be more reasonable than sending a young royal elsewhere for their own good? Here's a mainstream historical fact that anchors the unease. It was common practice for royal children to be raised away from their parents, often in separate households, monasteries, or foreign courts. This was framed as education, cultural refinement, or preparation for leadership. In reality, it also served political purposes: hostage diplomacy, character shaping, and sometimes quiet containment. You pause near a narrow bed, neatly made, never truly slept in. Children learned early that their lives were not their own. Affection was conditional, proximity temporary. and disappearance entirely possible. You imagine the moment of departure, no drama, no explanation that made sense to a child. Just a trunk packed by servants, a tutor suddenly assigned, a carriage waiting far too early in the morning. "You'll be back," someone probably said. And technically that was true. Sometimes there's a quirky tidbit historians like to mention because it feels so cruelly bureaucratic. In some courts, children sent away continued to appear in official records as if they were still present. Birthdays noted, allowances paid, names listed. On paper, nothing had changed. In reality, the distance grew until return felt hypothetical. You walk past a classroom, its windows high and narrow. This is where royal children were molded into something useful, or at least harmless. Lessons focused on obedience, theology, languages, and history as the court wanted it remembered. One well-established fact is that education was often used to reinforce loyalty to the ruling faction. What you learned depended on who sent you away. Historians still argue whether these separations were more damaging than beneficial. Some rulers emerged resilient, even grateful. Others emerged fearful, withdrawn, or fiercely paranoid. The same system produced wildly different results, which suggests the system itself cared less about outcomes than control. You stop at a long corridor lined with doors, each identical. This is where children disappeared into routine, individualities softened, questions discouraged. One fringe account tells of a young prince sent to a monastery temporarily who later asked a visiting courtier when he was allowed to stop being temporary. The answer, apparently, was silence. Whether the story is literal or symbolic hardly matters. The experience was real enough. Another light joke drifts in, because even now you need air. Suddenly, boarding school brochures start sounding like horror trailers. You think of Ivan VI again, that child emperor turned lifelong prisoner. But he wasn't alone in spirit. Many royal children were neutralized long before adulthood, not by chains but by distance, removed from influence, removed from relevance, removed from memory. One mainstream historical fact sharpens the picture. Courts often justified prolonged absences by citing health, delicate constitution, nervous temperament. The sea air will help. These phrases appear so frequently in letters that historians have learned to read them as code. Health was the most polite excuse for disappearance. You move toward a window overlooking a distant estate. This is where children were sent when the palace wanted them nearby, but out of sight. Country residences served as soft exile, safe, quiet, forgettable. There's a fringe rumor that some of these estates were intentionally underfunded to limit communication and travel. Isolation by budget, subtle, effective. Historians still argue whether such measures were acts of protection or preemptive suppression. Again, intention blurs with outcome. A child removed from court politics could be safer or simply easier to ignore. You imagine the long-term effects. A child who learns early that presence is conditional grows into an adult obsessed with control or resigned to irrelevance. Either way, trust fractures. This is how paranoia seeps into bloodlines. This is how future rulers learn to fear even their own families. Another gentle joke slips in because the heaviness is real. Suddenly being told to go to your room feels like amateur hour. You pass a small chapel again. Children prayed here too, for obedience, for patience, for return. Religion often framed separation as divine will. Acceptance was virtuous, resistance sinful. One well-known historical fact is that spiritual language was frequently used to normalize suffering, especially among the young. If God willed it, questioning felt dangerous. You stop, feeling the weight of all those unfulfilled returns. Some children did come back, changed accents, changed loyalties, changed selves. Others didn't. They married locally, took vows, died young, or simply faded into footnotes. Historians still argue how many royal children were effectively erased this way. Records are inconsistent. Names appear once and never again. And because nothing dramatic happened, no execution, no trial, the silence feels almost natural. That's the palace's greatest trick. You realize something quietly devastating. Sending children away trained everyone else too. It taught parents to detach, siblings to accept absence, courtiers to stop asking questions. Over time, separation became normal, expected, invisible. You turn back toward the main corridor. The palace looks unchanged as always. Official histories will frame these practices as practical, even enlightened. Education, safety, preparation. What they won't tell you is how many small lives learned, far too early, that love here had limits, and as you leave this wing, the rooms remain tidy, ready for the next child who needs to be somewhere else for reasons no one will ever fully explain. The palace doesn't miss them. It rarely ever does. You notice the locks before you notice the objects. Heavy, deliberate, a little excessive for rooms that are supposedly just storage. The palace doesn't bother hiding its caution here. It wants you to understand that what lies behind these doors isn't fragile, it's dangerous. This is where relics were sealed away, not because they were sacred, but because they told the wrong story. The air feels drier, older. Dust that hasn't been disturbed in generations clings to the corners. These rooms exist in a strange limbo between archive and oubliette. Officially, they preserve history. Unofficially, they quarantine it. Here's a mainstream historical fact to anchor you. Royal treasuries and archives routinely withheld objects from public view. Not everything uncovered in excavations, inheritances, or private collections was displayed. Items associated with scandal, illegitimacy, or political embarrassment were often catalogued and then quietly locked away. Preservation in this context meant containment. You move closer to a display case, imagining what might rest inside. Rings that sealed secret marriages, medals awarded and then revoked, portraits never meant to be seen. Objects don't forget, that's their problem. A letter can be burned, a person can be exiled, but an object persists, stubborn and mute, waiting for someone to ask the wrong question. There's a quirky tidbit historians whisper about with a mix of delight and frustration, mislabeled artifacts. Sometimes relics weren't destroyed at all, they were simply renamed. A crown jewel becomes ceremonial, a sword becomes decorative, a lock of hair becomes unidentified textile fragment. The truth survives, but only if you already know what you're looking at. You imagine a curator standing here centuries ago, weighing options. Destroying an object could raise suspicion. Keeping it visible could invite inquiry. Locking it away, properly catalogued, solved both problems. This is how secrets learned to sit still. Historians still argue whether these sealed collections were meant for eventual revelation or permanent silence. Some believe monarchies assumed future generations would be wiser, more forgiving. Others suspect the opposite. The time itself was the final accomplice. Wait long enough, and meaning dissolves. You pause near a shelf where something heavy once sat, its outline faintly visible in the dust. One mainstream fact sharpens the unease after major political upheavals, revolutions, coups, abdications. Palaces often conducted internal audits of their collections. Items connected to fallen regimes vanished at remarkable speed. Officially misplaced, practically erased. A fringe rumor persists about a set of jewels removed from display because they were linked to a morganatic marriage, legally valid, politically disastrous. The jewels weren't cursed, they were incriminating. Whether the story is literal or symbolic, it reflects a real pattern. Objects tied to forbidden narratives were treated like liabilities. Another light joke slips in because even secret vaults need a breather. This is basically the original archive folder labeled "Do Not Open," except with more gold and fewer sticky notes. You move deeper and the silence thickens. These rooms weren't meant for visitors. They were meant for forgetting. One well-known historical fact is that access to royal collections was tightly controlled, often limited to trusted insiders sworn to discretion. Knowledge itself was tiered. Seeing an object didn't mean understanding it. Understanding it didn't mean being allowed to speak. You think of how many debates hinge on what survives. A missing artifact can shift an entire historical interpretation. A sealed one can stall it indefinitely. Historians still argue whether certain relics, marriage contracts, baptismal tokens, personal seals exist somewhere, waiting, or whether they were destroyed outright. The absence becomes evidence, and that's a dangerous place to stand. You imagine future scholars standing where you stand now, speculating with careful language. Possibly, suggestive, indicates. This is what happens when objects are hidden but not gone. They haunt footnotes. You step back, suddenly aware that these relics weren't locked away out of shame alone. They were locked away because they worked. They could corroborate rumors, validate claims, destabilize narratives built over generations. Silence, again, was strategic. As you leave, the locks remain firm, untroubled by your curiosity. Official history will speak of preservation, of responsible stewardship. What it won't mention is fear, the quiet fear that an object left unchecked might speak louder than any living witness ever could. And the palace, satisfied, keeps its treasures exactly where they are, safe, silent, and just out of reach. You don't hear the voices at first, you feel them, a pressure behind the eyes, a sense that the air itself has absorbed words it was never meant to keep. This is the part of the palace where paper mattered more than people, where truth existed briefly, dangerously, before someone decided it didn't need to anymore. These rooms are quieter than the vaults, that's intentional. Sound carries less when walls are padded, when doors are thick, when footsteps are expected to be discreet. This is where confessions live just long enough to become a problem. Here's a mainstream historical fact that steadies you. Private diaries, letters, and personal testimonies were common among royals and courtiers, but survival rates are wildly uneven. Entire collections vanish after a death, especially when the author knew too much or loved too freely. What remains is rarely accidental. It's curated silence. You move toward a desk smaller than the others you've seen. This one wasn't meant for ceremony or policy. It was meant for release, a place to unload thoughts that couldn't survive daylight. You imagine a hand trembling slightly as ink touches paper, the writer fully aware that this act, this honesty, could be fatal if discovered. There's a quirky tidbit historians whisper about with almost guilty excitement. Some royal diarists wrote in multiple hands or switched scripts mid-entry to disguise authorship. Others used childish spelling or foreign languages to mask meaning. A few employed elaborate personal ciphers that no one bothered to crack until centuries later, if the pages survived that long. You pick up on the rhythm of it now: confession, followed by correction, truth, followed by editing. One well-known historical fact is that deathbed confessions were often witnessed, transcribed, and then revised before being archived. The dying spoke freely. The living decided what counted. Historians still argue whether these revisions were acts of mercy or manipulation. Was the goal to protect reputations or to preserve stability at any cost? Again, the answer refuses to be singular. You imagine a royal on their last night, breath shallow, guards posted just outside. They speak of things that no longer matter to them, betrayals, doubts, loves they were never allowed to name. A clerk listens, a priest nods. A family member weeps carefully. And somewhere between that room and the archive, something is lost. You walk past shelves that look too orderly. You've learned by now to distrust neatness. Documents here are categorized by date, subject, author. But those categories lie. One mainstream fact cuts through the calm. Many royal archives show signs of deliberate gaps, years missing, correspondence abruptly ending, a life documented right up until the moment it becomes inconvenient. A fringe account floats through your mind. A servant claimed to have seen a stack of journals burned the night a queen died, the smoke mixed with incense so no one would question the smell. Whether that exact scene occurred hardly matters. We know destruction like this happened. Fires were tidy. Flames didn't gossip. Another light joke slips in because the tension is building. Suddenly deleting your search history feels like a very modern echo of an ancient instinct. You pause near a narrow window high enough to prevent distraction. Confessionals often sat nearby. Words spoken to priests were supposed to be sacred, sealed by doctrine, but doctrine bent under crowns. One well-established historical fact is that royal confessors were deeply entangled in politics, often reporting sensitive information upward under the guise of spiritual guidance. Confidentiality, it turns out, had exceptions. Historians still argue how much these clerics knew and how much they revealed. Some protected secrets fiercely, others used them as leverage. The problem with secrets is that once shared, they stop belonging to you. You imagine the inner conflict of someone tasked with hearing truth in a system built on appearances. To speak was betrayal. To stay silent was complicity. Many chose silence and were rewarded for it. You move deeper and the rooms feel almost domestic again. This is where private papers were kept before being processed. That word does a lot of work. Processing meant sorting, copying, summarizing and deciding. What stays? What goes? What gets rephrased so thoroughly it barely resembles the original sentiment? One mainstream historical fact is that royal correspondence was often recopied into official registers, with tones softened and controversy removed. Originals were sometimes destroyed once the safe version existed. Historians still argue whether these copies were meant as preservation or sanitization, probably both. Efficiency and control make excellent partners. There's a fringe detail that refuses to go away. Some archivists left subtle marks, misaligned letters, repeated phrases, deliberate spelling errors to signal that a document had been altered. Whether this was intentional resistance or coincidence is debated, but scholars have found patterns that suggest not everyone agreed with the edits they were ordered to make. You let that settle. Even within systems of erasure, there were quiet dissenters, people who couldn't speak openly, but couldn't fully comply either. It's a comforting thought in a restrained sort of way. Another gentle joke drifts in because you need one. Imagine footnoting your own censorship. This part removed, future historians. You stop beside a locked cabinet, and this one feels different. Smaller, more personal. These were the items that weren't dangerous enough to destroy, but too dangerous to share. A half-written letter, a confession never sent, a page torn from a journal and hidden instead of burned. One well-known historical fact is that some of the most revealing documents survived precisely because they were incomplete. A fragment feels safer than a whole truth. Historians still argue how much weight to give these fragments. Is a half-sentence evidence or projection? Does absence imply intention or accident? When sources are scarce, interpretation becomes an act of imagination restrained by caution. you think of all the confessions that never reached paper at all, words spoken in whispers, in tears, in moments of exhaustion, those left no archive. They live only in the shape of decisions that followed, marriages arranged, heirs displaced, wars justified with language that feels just slightly too personal. As you move toward the exit, the pressure lifts a little. The palace doesn't like prolonged attention here. It prefers you unsettled but not focused. Official history will claim these archives are incomplete because time is cruel. What it won't admit is how often time was helped along. You take one last look. The desks are tidy, the shelves are lined. Everything suggests order. What it conceals is fear, the fear that honesty, left unattended, might outlive the people who tried to bury it. And as you step away, the voices fade back into the walls, waiting patiently for the next person who thinks silence means nothing happened at all. You sense the shift before you see the robes. The palace air changes here, thick with incense and authority, a blend meant to soothe conscience while sharpening control. This is where spiritual power brushed too close to political power and pretended not to notice. The priests who moved through these corridors were meant to hear everything and say nothing. In practice, they often heard too much. You step carefully. Even now it feels like the wrong place to make noise. Here's a mainstream historical fact to anchor you. In most monarchies, royal confessors and senior clerics held extraordinary access to rulers. They heard private doubts, marital frustrations, political fears, and moral compromises. This access made them invaluable and dangerous. Religion offered legitimacy to power, but proximity to power tested religious integrity constantly. You pass a small chapel, candles burning low, wax pooled like frozen tears. Confessionals line the wall, carved with comforting symbols. Forgiveness was supposed to live here, but confession is information, and information is leverage. The palace understood that long before modern intelligence agencies did. There's a quirky tidbit historians share with a mix of fascination and discomfort. Some royal confessors kept private notebooks, ostensibly to track spiritual progress. In reality, these notes sometimes read like political briefings, names, dates, emotional weaknesses. Whether intended for personal memory or future use is still debated, but the existence of such records is undeniable. You imagine a ruler kneeling here, crown set aside, voice lowered. They speak of doubts about heirs, resentment towards spouses, fear of rebellion. They speak freely because the space promises safety. But outside the lattice, the world waits, and sometimes the lattice leaks. Historians still argue whether priests deliberately exploited their position or were pressured into cooperation. The truth shifts case by case. Some resisted fiercely, others rationalized disclosure as protecting the realm or the church. When survival is on the line, morality learns to bend. You move past a corridor connecting chapel to private apartments. This proximity wasn't accidental. Spiritual guidance was meant to be immediate, intimate. One well-known historical fact is that confessors sometimes influenced royal decisions directly, advising on marriages, punishments, and even warfare under the guise of moral counsel. God wills it has always been a flexible phrase. A fringe anecdote lingers about a confessor who refused absolution unless a ruler abandoned a favored advisor. Official records describe a sudden change of heart at court shortly afterward. Coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps faith was used as a lever rather than a light. Another light joke drifts in because the tension is tightening. Imagine therapy sessions where your therapist also reports directly to your boss and God. Relaxing, right? You stop near a side room where clerics met privately. This is where information flowed upward. One mainstream historical fact is that churches and palaces shared intelligence networks. Monasteries gathered news, bishops corresponded across borders, confessors, intentionally or not, fed this system. Spiritual silence was ideal. Political silence was optional. Historians still argue how much of this was institutional policy versus individual choice. Was there a grand design or simply a series of compromises made by men convinced they were preventing greater harm? The ambiguity protects everyone involved. You imagine the internal conflict of a priest who knows a queen doubts her marriage or a king fears his heir. To reveal it could destabilize a dynasty. To conceal it could implicate the priest when things collapse anyway. Silence again becomes strategy. You pass another chapel, smaller, almost hidden. This one feels different, less ceremonial, more urgent. Emergency prayers happened here. Sudden illnesses, dangerous births, moments when secrets spilled because fear loosened tongues. One well-known historical fact is that last confessions often contain political information that never made it into official records. The soul was saved, the truth was not. There's a fringe rumor that some clerics deliberately misremembered confessions, blurring details to protect themselves later. Selective memory as self-defense. Whether intentional or subconscious, it reminds you that even truth-tellers are human. Another gentle joke because you need one. Suddenly, I can't tell you, it's confidential, feels like a phrase, doing a lot of heavy lifting across centuries. You feel the weight of all those unspoken disclosures. Priests weren't villains by default. Many were trapped between vows and violence, conscience and consequence, but the system didn't care about intention. It cared about results. And the result was a palace that knew far more than it admitted, and admitted far less than it knew. As you move on, the incense fades, the corridors widen. Official history will frame religion as moral guidance, separate from political intrigue. What it won't fully confront is how often faith became a funnel through which secrets traveled upward, quietly reshaping decisions that altered lives. You leave this wing understanding something crucial. Secrecy doesn't survive on silence alone. It survives on trust, misplaced in systems that promise safety while quietly taking notes. And the palace, ever pragmatic, keeps its confessors close enough to hear everything, and far enough to deny responsibility when the truth leaks out anyway. You step into brighter space again, and for a moment it feels like relief. High ceilings, banners, maps unfurled across walls like bold promises. This is where wars were justified, announced, and later romanticized. Officially, conflicts began over borders, succession rights, or insults to national honor. Unofficially, many of them started right here, with wounded pride, private grudges, and moments someone couldn't forgive. You slow down because this is where personal emotion put on armor and called itself destiny. Here's a mainstream historical fact to ground you. While wars were framed as matters of state, many were catalyzed by individual decisions made by monarchs reacting to perceived slights, rivalries, or humiliations. Diplomatic incidents often masked deeply personal motivations. The machinery of war required public reasons. The spark was frequently private. You stop near a massive map table, scarred by years of rings, knives, and anxious fingers. You imagine a ruler leaning over it, jaw tight, replaying a conversation that didn't go their way. An ambassador smirked. A marriage proposal was rejected. A rival mocked them just a little too publicly. These moments rarely made it into declarations, but they mattered. There's a quirky tidbit historians mention with a raised eyebrow. Some monarchs annotated maps themselves, scribbling notes fueled by frustration rather than strategy. Borders weren't just lines, they were insults waiting to be corrected. Cartography became therapy, and everyone else paid for it. Historians still argue whether such wars were inevitable or avoidable. Would conflict have erupted anyway due to economic pressure and alliance systems? Or did one person's wounded ego accelerate everything? The The debate remains open because systems and personalities are tangled beyond clean separation. You walk past a wall of tapestries depicting heroic battles. Notice what's missing. No arguments, no tantrums, no sleepless nights where pride outweighed reason. One well-known historical fact is that war art was propaganda long before the term existed. Its sanitized origins and glorified outcomes conveniently omitting the petty beginnings. You imagine a private argument between spouses overheard by the wrong person, or a lover discarded later aligning with an enemy court. Forbidden love, remember? It doesn't disappear, it migrates. Personal humiliation can ripple outward until it wears a uniform. Another light joke slips in because the stakes are enormous. Nothing says let's invade quite like refusing to leave someone on read, 17th century edition. You pause near a set of correspondence files. Diplomatic letters sound formal, but tone matters. A delayed reply, an overly polite phrase, a missing honorific. One mainstream historical fact is that courts obsessed over diplomatic etiquette because disrespect, real or imagined, could justify retaliation. War could begin over punctuation-level offence. There's a fringe anecdote about a monarch who launched a campaign after a rival refused to stand during a meeting. Whether literal or exaggerated, it captures a truth. Power is sensitive. Public embarrassment in hierarchical societies wasn't just personal, it was existential. Historians still argue how often advisors attempted to de-escalate these moments. Some records suggest frantic, behind-the-scenes efforts to calm rulers down. Others suggest courtiers learned when to stop trying. You don't argue with someone who controls armies and believes history is watching. You move toward tall windows overlooking training grounds. Soldiers drill below, unaware of how close their futures often were to someone else's bad day. This is the most unsettling realization. Thousands marched because one person couldn't let something go. Another gentle joke drifts in because otherwise it's too stark. Suddenly, sleep on it before replying feels like underrated advice for world peace. You feel the echo of all those wars that official history frames as necessary. Defensive, inevitable. What it rarely admits is how often necessity was constructed after the fact. Pride found reasons. Rage found rhetoric. And the palace supplied both with ceremony. You leave this space understanding something crucial. Wars didn't only start in councils, they started in private rooms, quiet insults, unresolved resentments. The maps came later, and as you move on, the banners flutter softly as if they too know how thin the line is between personal grievance and public catastrophe. The brightness fades again, not dramatically, just enough to lower your voice without asking. This part of the palace smells faintly of herbs and boiled linens, an attempt at cleanliness layered over something more anxious. Sick rooms were never meant to be comforting. They were meant to reassure the outside world that everything was under control, even when it clearly wasn't. You slow your pace. Illness has a way of demanding that. Here's a mainstream historical fact to anchor you. Royal illnesses were routinely disguised, downplayed, or renamed to protect the image of strength and continuity. Physical weakness threatened legitimacy. Mental distress threatened authority, so both were softened into acceptable language: melancholy, fatigue, nervous disposition. Words did the work medicine couldn't. You pass a bedchamber with windows kept deliberately small. Light was rationed, visitors controlled, information filtered. This was how health became a state secret. A ruler might be bedridden for weeks, but official bulletins spoke of temporary indisposition. The palace never lied outright. It just chose adjectives carefully. There's a quirky tidbit historians often note with quiet disbelief. Court physicians were expected to practice optimism. Pessimistic diagnoses could be considered disloyal. In some courts, doctors who spoke too honestly found themselves dismissed, or worse. Prognosis wasn't just medical, it was political. You imagine the tension in these rooms. A physician notices tremors, a queen observes mood swings that don't pass, a servant hears sobbing at night that no one mentions by morning. One well-known historical fact is that mental illness, in particular, was aggressively reframed. Episodes of depression, anxiety, or psychosis were attributed to spiritual weakness, overwork, or divine testing, anything but instability. Historians still argue whether these euphemisms were meant to protect the individual or the institution, perhaps both. But the effect was silence. Suffering without language becomes invisible. You stop near a small table crowded with vials. Remedies ranged from herbal infusions to bloodletting to treatments that likely worsened symptoms, a fringe detail that surfaces repeatedly. Mercury. Used for everything from syphilis to nervous complaints, it caused tremors, memory loss and paranoia. Symptoms that were then blamed on the original illness. Medicine here could become a feedback loop. Another light joke slips in because you need one. Suddenly WebMD doesn't seem quite so alarming by comparison. You walk past a sitting room where family members waited, coached on how to appear concerned but calm. Panic was contagious. So was doubt. One mainstream historical fact is that succession planning often accelerated during periods of royal illness, even when recovery was expected. Contingency conversations happened quietly, sometimes prematurely. Historians still argue whether some illnesses were exaggerated to justify removing a ruler from power. The line between care and convenience blurred easily. Declaring someone unfit solved problems. Proving it later was unnecessary if the outcome stuck. You think of rulers like George III, whose mental health struggles were simultaneously documented and obscured, debated then and now. What mattered at the time wasn't diagnosis, it was control. Who spoke for the crown when the crown couldn't speak for itself? Another gentle joke drifts in because the heaviness is building. Suddenly, taking a mental health day feels like a radical concept. You pause near a corridor that leads nowhere obvious. This is where patients were moved when they became embarrassing. Out of sight. Out of mind. One fringe rumor tells of a royal relative confined for decades under the guise of rest. Officially alive, practically erased. Historians still argue how many such cases existed because records politely stop. You feel the weight of that erasure. Illness didn't just weaken bodies, it weakened claims, and the palace responded not with empathy but with editing. Language adjusted, appearances maintained, decisions made without consent. As you move on, you realize something quietly unsettling. By disguising illness, the palace taught itself to distrust vulnerability. Weakness became dangerous, honesty became optional, and future rulers absorbed that lesson deeply. Official history will speak of stoic endurance and dignified suffering. What it won't fully acknowledge is how many lives were reshaped, or quietly sidelined, because admitting pain threatened power. You leave the sick rooms behind, but the careful language follows you. Here, even suffering had to perform. And if it couldn't, it was politely renamed, until it disappeared. You feel the tension sharpen as you enter this part of the palace, not louder, never louder, but tighter, like a room where the air has been pulled too thin. This is where compliance mattered most, and where resistance was easiest to mislabel. The corridors here don't feel sickly or secretive. They feel judicial, decisive, clean in a way that suggests conclusions have already been reached. This is where women were branded mad. Here's a mainstream historical fact to ground you. Throughout royal history, women who defied expectations, politically, sexually, or socially, were frequently diagnosed as unstable. Emotional expression that would be tolerated, even celebrated in men, became evidence of hysteria in women. The diagnosis wasn't medical, it was administrative. You walk past a suite of rooms set slightly apart from the rest of the palace. Comfortable, yes. Luxurious even, but separated, controlled. This is what respectable confinement looked like. No chains, no dungeon, just distance and a very convincing explanation. You imagine a queen raising objections too often, asking why, refusing to smile on command, mourning too long, loving too fiercely. These behaviors didn't need to be punished if they could be reclassified. Once labeled unstable, a woman no longer needed to be argued with. Her words stopped counting. There's a quirky tidbit historians often point out with quiet frustration. Medical terms were retrofitted to behavior. Melancholy, nervous disorder, excessive imagination. These diagnoses shifted conveniently depending on the political climate. When a woman was useful, she was passionate. When she wasn't, she was unwell. Historians still argue whether some of these women truly suffered from mental illness or were victims of strategic misdiagnosis. The cruel truth is that both can be true at once. A system capable of exploitation doesn't require perfect health to operate, only opportunity. You stop near a window overlooking gardens that feel more like boundaries than beauty. Walking paths loop back on themselves. Benches face inward. Everything encourages contemplation, not escape. One well-known historical fact is that royal women deemed unstable were often kept under constant observation, their correspondence monitored, their visitors restricted. Protection, it was called. Control, it functioned as. Another light joke slips in because the weight is real. Suddenly being told to calm down feels like it has a much longer, darker resume. You imagine how it felt to realize the rules had changed without announcement. Yesterday, you were consulted. Today, you are managed. Decisions happen around you, not with you. Your objections are documented as symptoms. Your silence becomes confirmation. There's a fringe account of a queen whose letters grew increasingly precise after her confinement. Careful handwriting, measured tone, relentless logic. Scholars debate whether this was clarity or performance. Historians still argue whether she was trying to prove sanity or simply documenting injustice for someone who might one day listen. You move past a sitting room where embroidery frames hang unfinished, abandoned projects, interrupted selves. One mainstream historical fact is that women in confinement were often encouraged to engage in calming activities, sewing, reading devotional texts, light music, expression without influence, occupation without impact. You feel the injustice sharpen. Labeling dissent as madness didn't just silence women, it warned others. Speak carefully, feel quietly, or risk becoming a diagnosis. Another gentle joke drifts in because even anger needs a valve. Suddenly, gaslighting doesn't feel like a modern invention at all. You realize something crucial here. Declaring a woman mad solved multiple problems at once. It removed her from power, invalidated her testimony, preserved the appearance of order. And because it was framed as concern, resistance looked cruel. Official history often frames these women as tragic, unstable figures, footnotes to more serious events. What it rarely asks is who benefited from their disappearance, who gained authority when their voices were discounted. As you leave this wing, the rooms remain immaculate, the language remains polite, the records remain careful, and the lesson lingers. In the palace, sanity was not a condition, it was a permission. And permission, as you've learned by now, could always be revoked. You feel the atmosphere shift again as you move on, but this time it isn't silence that greets you, it's tension. A low, persistent hum, like a wire pulled too tight. This is where heirs grew up, not in comfort exactly, though there was plenty of that, but in vigilance. Every corridor here feels watched, every room designed to impress a lesson without ever stating it outright. This is where fear was taught early. Here's a mainstream historical fact to anchor you. Royal heirs were raised under intense scrutiny from birth, often surrounded by tutors, guards, and courtiers whose loyalty was divided between the child and the institution. Their education emphasized duty, lineage, and the catastrophic consequences of failure. Childhood, as a concept, was secondary. You pass a series of practice rooms, sword training, languages, scripture, governance, every skill framed as preparation, every mistake recorded, remembered, sometimes repeated back later as warning. You imagine a child corrected not just for error, but for tone, for hesitation, for asking the wrong question in front of the wrong person. There's a quirky tidbit historians often note with uneasy amusement. Some heirs were given shadow siblings, other noble children raised alongside them, meant to provide companionship while also serving as comparisons. Motivation through rivalry, affection laced with surveillance. It's hard to relax when your playmate might also be your benchmark. You stop near a narrow bed, larger than the children's rooms you saw earlier, but still oddly austere. Comfort was considered softening. One well-known historical fact is that heirs were often denied privacy as a matter of principle. Someone was always listening, someone always reporting. The lesson was clear: power attracts observation. Get used to it. Historians still argue whether this upbringing produced strong rulers or deeply anxious ones. Evidence supports both. What's undeniable is that many heirs grew up expecting betrayal, not as a possibility, but as a feature of life. You imagine overhearing fragments of conversation meant to be overheard. Remember what happened to your uncle? You know why we don't speak of her? Warnings disguised as anecdotes, fear passed down like heirlooms. Another light joke slips in because the pressure is immense. Suddenly, tiger parenting feels like it needs a historical disclaimer. You walk past a study lined with portraits of former rulers. Some faces look stern, others look haunted. This wasn't accidental. One mainstream historical fact is that royal portraiture for heirs often emphasized gravity over warmth, reminding them daily of expectations waiting ahead. Smiling too much suggested frivolity. Doubt suggested weakness. There's a fringe story of an heir who insisted on keeping a childhood toy hidden in a desk drawer well into adulthood. When discovered, it was quietly removed. Sentimentality was tolerated only until it looked like vulnerability. Historians still argue how early paranoia set in for many future rulers. Letters reveal children worrying about plots, betrayal, and loyalty long before such concerns were reasonable. But in a palace, reason doesn't matter as much as precedent. And precedent taught fear. You pause near a window overlooking the city beyond the palace walls. This view was deliberate. A reminder of what waited outside: crowds, unrest, unpredictability. One well-known historical fact is that heirs were often taken to witness public punishments or unrest as instruction. Power, they learned, had consequences. So did weakness. Another gentle joke drifts in because you need a breath. Suddenly, trust issues sounds less like a personality flaw and more like inherited trauma. You realize something quietly devastating. These children didn't just inherit crowns, they inherited unfinished stories, vanished relatives, whispered scandals. Every absence became a lesson, every silence a warning. By the time an heir reached adulthood, fear wasn't a reaction, it was a reflex. Control felt safer than connection, distance safer than affection. And when these children eventually ruled, they ruled as they had been taught, cautiously, suspiciously, sometimes cruelly. As you leave this wing, the rooms remain perfectly ordered. Lessons complete, childhood concluded. Official history will describe these rulers as hardened, disciplined, prepared. What it won't say is how much of that preparation was built on quiet terror. And as the palace lets you pass, you understand that fear wasn't an accident here. It was curriculum. You feel the weight of stone before you see the tombs. The palace doesn't advertise this place, but it doesn't hide it either. It relies on reverence to keep people quiet. Here, silence isn't enforced, it's expected. This is where truths were buried alongside bodies, sealed under marble and ritual, trusted never to rise again. You slow instinctively. Everyone does. Here's a mainstream historical fact to anchor you. Royal burials were meticulously choreographed political events. Where someone was buried, how quickly, and with which honours all communicated legitimacy. Tombs were not just memorials, they were statements. And statements, like everything else here, could be edited. You pass effigies carved in serene repose, hands folded, faces calm. Death smooths everything out. Conflict dissolves into stone. An executed traitor might be rebranded as a lost son. A disgraced queen becomes a devoted wife. Language again does the heavy lifting. You pause near a sarcophagus set slightly apart from the others. Distance in burial meant something. Proximity to the main altar meant something else. One well-known historical fact is that denied burial honours were among the most powerful posthumous punishments a court could inflict. Even in death, hierarchy mattered. There's a quirky tidbit historians share in hushed tones. Some royal tombs were deliberately misidentified for generations. Names altered, dates shifted. In at least one case, bones were moved to align a burial with a more convenient narrative. The dead, it turns out, could be relocated if it helped the living sleep better. You imagine the moment when the lid closed. Whatever questions remained were supposed to stay beneath it. Who really fathered whom? Whether a death was natural, whether a confession had ever been made. Once buried, the story hardened. Historians still argue whether burial practices were meant to honor the deceased or control the living. Was the goal remembrance or closure enforced by authority? Again, the answer refuses to choose a side. You walk past wall plaques listing names and reigns, stripped to essentials, dates, titles, no adjectives that might invite curiosity. One mainstream historical fact stands out starkly. Epitaphs were often approved by committees. Grief was filtered, praise standardized, ambiguity eliminated. You stop near a small side chapel where candles flicker low. This is where unofficial mourning happened, where servants, former allies, or forgotten relatives came quietly. There's a fringe account of a maid who visited a royal tomb weekly for decades, leaving no name, only flowers. Whether she mourned love, loyalty, or guilt is unknown. The palace never asked. Another light joke drifts in, because even here, your mind needs relief. Suddenly, rest in peace feels like a legally binding request. You look closer at the floor. Some stones are newer than others. Renovations happen. Reinterpretations too. One well-known historical fact is that renovations of royal burial sites often coincided with regime changes. New rulers adjusted emphasis. Old scandals were literally paved over. Historians still argue whether missing remains indicate foul play or simple disorganization. Bones were moved during wars, restorations, and religious reforms. But absence here feels intentional. When someone vanishes twice, once in life, once in death, it's hard not to suspect design. You imagine future generations walking these same paths, reading the same names, never knowing what was omitted. That's the power of burial. It finalizes, it discourages questions by framing them as disrespect. Another gentle joke slips in because even solemnity can crack. Nothing kills a conspiracy theory faster than "please lower your voice." This is a sacred space. You feel the accumulated hush pressing in. Tombs teach obedience. They suggest that everything has already been settled, that arguments ended here, but you've learned better by now. Death didn't end secrets. It protected them. You step back, realizing something quietly unsettling. The palace trusted time more than guards. Time erodes outrage, softens memory, turns sharp questions into academic debates. Bury a truth long enough, and it becomes uncertain. Official history will call these tombs places of honor. And they are, in a way, but they are also vaults, designed to keep the past from interfering with the present. As you leave, the candles continue burning. The stone remains unmoved, and beneath it all, truths lie patiently, knowing they don't need to escape. They only need to wait. You don't feel the palace end so much as loosen its grip. The corridors widen, the ceilings lift, and the silence becomes less intentional, more tired. This is where everything you've seen settles, not into answers, but into echoes. The palace doesn't argue with you anymore. It lets the past hum quietly, confident that most people will stop listening long before they understand. You slow your steps because this is the part that lingers. Here's a mainstream historical fact to anchor the realization forming in you. Many modern royal traditions, protocols, and even public scandals are shaped directly by centuries-old efforts to suppress, sanitize, or redirect uncomfortable truths. What survives into the present isn't just ceremony, it's habit. Silence learned long ago, still practiced. You pass through a familiar corridor now. You recognize it because you've been here before, not physically, but emotionally. This is where whispers from Section 1 return, layered with everything that followed. The erased heirs, the quiet queens, the children sent away, the deaths explained too neatly. None of it feels isolated anymore. It feels systemic. There's a quirky tidbit historians love pointing out with a kind of weary amusement. Some modern royal households still maintain restricted archives whose contents are sealed for a set number of years, often extended just before expiration, officially routine, practically eternal. The instinct to delay truth hasn't gone anywhere. It's just learned better language. Historians still argue whether full transparency would destabilize monarchies or strengthen them. Would revealing everything cause collapse or finally allow trust? The debate remains unresolved because it requires confronting not just past actions, but present identities built on them. You stop near a balcony overlooking the city beyond the palace walls. Lights glow softly. Life goes on. Most people sleep unaware of how much careful forgetting made their world feel stable. One well-known historical fact is that revolutions often erupt, not because secrets exist, but because they suddenly stop being contained. Truth isn't explosive by nature. Pressure is. Another light joke drifts in because you've earned it. Turns out, family secrets really will follow you forever, especially if your family owns a palace. You think back through everything you've seen. None of it required monsters. Just people choosing convenience over clarity, order over honesty, silence over discomfort. That's what makes it unsettling. The palace didn't bury history out of cruelty alone. It buried it because burying worked. And here's the part official history rarely admits. Those buried secrets didn't disappear. They shaped behavior. They taught caution. They trained fear. They made future rulers suspicious, distant, controlled. The palace you're standing in now is built as much from memory as from stone. You notice how modern this all feels. PR statements, carefully worded announcements, strategic absences, illnesses described vaguely, relatives stepping back. None of it is new. It's just updated. The echoes still bounce. Historians still argue whether we are living in a more honest age or simply a louder one. More information exists than ever, but so do more sophisticated ways to manage it. The palace may look quieter now, but it hasn't forgotten its lessons. You take a breath and realize something gently profound. Knowing these secrets doesn't make you cynical. It makes you attentive. It teaches you where to listen, what to question, what absence might mean. And the palace, sensing this, does something rare. It lets you go. The doors open easily now, no guards rush forward, no locks protest. You step out carrying nothing tangible, just a deeper awareness of how history behaves when no one is watching. And as the night settles around you, the palace fades behind stone and shadow, still standing, still silent, still full of stories that didn't die. They just learned to whisper. The pace softens now, the sharp edges of intrigue dull into something quieter, more distant. You no longer need to hold every detail tightly. Let the corridors blur, let the faces fade. The palace is still there, but it doesn't demand your attention anymore. Its secrets can rest. So can you. Your breathing slows, your thoughts stretch out unhurried. History becomes background hum rather than sharp signal. Nothing needs solving tonight. Nothing needs defending. Just the steady reassurance that even the heaviest stories lose their weight when you set them down. You're safe, you're still, and the night is wide enough to hold every unfinished thought until morning comes gently.